So we're going to be looking at stories that particularly of fathers and daughters, and the reason I chose this theme was because generally in fairy tales the protagonist is male. And you probably notice that very, very few fairy tales name the protagonist, name the hero or the heroine. Snow White is an exception, Tom Thumb is an exception, Jack and his beanstalk is an exception. Usually it is just there was a boy, there was a girl, there was a prince, there was a princess. It's usually in that mode. And the reason for that is that they represent a principle rather than representing a person. It's always in that way. And when we tell these stories to children, children absolutely love them, almost universally. It's if you tell the story the right way, particularly if you tell it and don't read it, it captures the child, because the child, I would suggest to you, because we're in a spiritual environment here, the child still has some memories of where it comes from, and still has some sense of there is more to the world than what I see outside. And when they get the story once upon a time, or in a place, east of the sun, west of the moon, or whatever, they immediately know, yes, that's right, there's another realm. And so these stories echo with the child and can awaken things within them. That's why it's so important that children have stories, and that they have stories that have these sublime meanings tucked away in them. And probably many of you here, when you were children, read myths, because people who are attracted to the spiritual life tend to get attracted to mythology, because you sense there's something in mythology. So the stories we're going to look at today, we're going to look at Capo Rushes, because it's a traditional English fairy tale, but you'll see it's in the Cinderella school. We're going to look at All Kinds of Fur, which comes from one of the Grimm fairy tales, and that will make up our morning. Prior to that, I'm going to use what I think is probably my favourite fairy tale of all time, which is the Goose Girl, to represent the stages of spiritual unfoldment that you often find in a fairy tale, told in different ways. You can see it very clearly in this story. So we'll take that as our map so we know where we're going. So I'm going to suggest to you that fairy tales, when we approach them in the right way, can in their own way be a key to spiritual awakening, or spiritual insight at least. That if you dwell with these stories, they can open up possibilities within you, because they speak directly to the intuition rather than to you have to use the intuition to sort of penetrate into them, and the higher imagination to get a sense of what they might mean. And as I suggested earlier, we can take the Goose Girl as being a map of awareness. The Goose Girl sets off with her maid. She gets usurped by the maid. Her horse gets executed. She looks after the geese, and finally she gets back to her proper estate. So we can see this as being a spiritual journey. Initially, the story starts with the mother, and the mother is sending her daughter off to a far country where a prince awaits her. And the mother says, "Take this with you," and takes her handkerchief, her white handkerchief, on which she drops 3 drops of her blood. And she gives that to the daughter so that the link with the mother is never lost. And the daughter sets off with the maid on her horse, but she's thirsty. And they're near a convenient river, and she goes and she drinks from the river. And when she drinks from the river, she loses the handkerchief. And she drinks 3 times from the river. And by the 3rd time that she's drunk from the river, she's confused about who she is. She's forgotten where she comes from, and the maid is sitting on her horse. And she now walks, and the maid now rides, until they come to where the prince dwells. And when they arrive there, the maid says, "I'm the princess come to marry the prince." And who can say otherwise, because the princess has forgotten, and she's standing there holding the horse. And the powers that be in that town say, "What about this woman?" She says, "She's just a goose girl." So the Goose Girl goes out to look after the geese, and we can see a picture of her here. And the maid organises for the horse Falada to have its head cut off. And the head is put over the doorway. And the Goose Girl leaves every morning and returns every night. So we have the Goose Girl passing through this threshold at dawn and at dusk. And at those times, the horse speaks to her. And the horse says, and always 3 times, you know, how your mother would grieve to have been forgotten, that you've forgotten who she is. Rudolf Steiner, the great Austrian savant and mystic, he said that what is being represented here is the threshold of consciousness at dawn and dusk. And probably all of us have had the experience of certain ideas come as we wake. And certain ideas come as we prepare for sleep. That there's an openness. And it's recognised within the Christian church with matins and with vespers that there are particular type of celebration is done at dawn and is done at dusk to represent the relationship with the divine at that point in time, because the veils, if you like, are thinner at that point of time. And our consciousness is less in the world because we've been in a dream state. We're slightly out of our normal state, and probably everyone in the room has experienced that to some degree or another. So what's represented in the story here is that as at that point there's a better connection, and therefore those people who teach meditation say that's a good time to meditate. And you will see that the Goose Girl is taking the geese. And she takes them out, and she has a companion called Conrad. And Conrad is there to help her look after the geese. And Conrad sees her hair, because she lets her hair down when she's out and on her own, and it's beautiful golden hair. And Conrad says, "Can I touch it?" And the Goose Girl calls up a wind, and the wind blows Conrad's hat off, and he chases the hat. He chases after the hat, and he never gets to touch her hair. But he sees it. He's aware that it's there. And he tells the king, this is not any usual person. There's something special about her. I've seen it. And the Goose Girl will say nothing about who she really is. She's beginning to remember now, and she will say nothing about who she really is. But she does kneel in front of a stove, and the stove is made of iron. And there she tells about her story, because now she has remembered. She tells her story, and the king listens at the chimney, and he hears her story. So let's see what this might mean. You have the Goose Girl. She loses her sense of her origin. As she passes in and out the city, as she passes through stages of consciousness, she begins to get a memory of who she is, because she gets reminded by whatever is represented by the horse that's had its head taken off. She goes out, and Conrad sees her hair, but he has no right to touch her hair, and she calls up a wind that blows the hat off, which he chases. But he is able to inform the king. She kneels in front of a stove, having a recognition of who she is. The king hears, and then she gets rightfully replaced. The horse will represent that bit of the higher consciousness that can just pinprick us with a sense of this is right, this is wrong. It can't tell you what to do, but it can tell you when what you're doing is not right. So it's like the voice of conscience, or it's that impression that comes in, and it can be there at the beginning and ends of the day when we're not in the throe of life. Conrad, I would suggest to you, and this is not the only interpretation, but Conrad, I would suggest to you, represents the ordinary everyday consciousness. Therefore, he's chasing his hat. Hat, head, thinking. So if you're looking with symbols, if you're looking at crowns and hats, it's almost always to do with thinking. And the wind, as you know, the airy realm, is thought. So he's always chasing his thoughts, because that's what the mind does. If we stop, most of us here probably have tried to meditate, and as you try to meditate, the thoughts come in. It's the very first stage of trying to learn to meditate, is you just get loads of thoughts come in. And that's Conrad, who chases the hat all the time. But it's not the wisdom of the Goose Girl. And that wisdom gradually has to come into being, and it comes about through an alchemical process. So there has to be the stove, there has to be a change that takes place with heat. There has to be a humility that she learns, and then the Goose Girl has to learn wisdom in a way, because she learned foolishness very early on by forgetting her origin. She learns her wisdom, and then the king, representing again a higher part of the mind, the king hears and can make sense of what is going on, and then she can be rightfully related to the prince. And because this is not a namby-pamby fairy tale, but a grim fairy tale, and the clue is in the name, the maid gets treated pretty badly in this. So we can see this as stages of awareness. The divine wisdom is hidden within us. We never lose that. And it's there, but we have to listen. We have to tune into it. We have to manage our geese. You can see these as the lower mind, the lower thoughts, the everyday thoughts. We have to manage those. If they crowd into our awareness, we'll never be able to tune into anything else. So being the Goose Girl is very symbolic in that sense. The logical bit of your mind cannot make sense of these universal truths because they're not logical. They're above logic. They rest in divine reason. They don't rest in human logic. So therefore, to logically try and work them out or scientifically measure them is impossible. So Conrad can know there is wisdom. Conrad can see the golden hair, but he can't touch it. It's not for him to touch. If he touches it, it's pulled down to his level, and he's forever chasing his hat. He can, however, inform the king. And a process has to take place in everybody's life one way or another for there to be a spiritual awakening, for there to be a growing sense of we're a spiritual being, not just a natural being, not just a creature of nature. And we mustn't forget Conrad, because he's absolutely necessary. Our mind is necessary. We can't get rid of our mind. And those meditative techniques that say meditation is about getting rid of your mind is like a contradiction in terms, because the very word meditation rests on the word mens in Latin, which is mind. So, to approach your mind by not having a mind is an impossible task, I would suggest. But Conrad can't be in charge. So we can see these stages now in this way. At first, and this is where children are, at first we just have a knowing. We know. We just know as children, if we do, we just know as children there's something more. But we can lose that. We have to regain it. And it can come to us through tradition. We can know that there are these spiritual traditions. We can be awakened to Hinduism and Buddhism and so on. But knowing those traditions exist doesn't mean that we have unfolded that inner certainty inside ourselves. So the first step, as seen from this map, the Goose Girl map, is to acquire knowledge. We need to have knowledge in order not to be ignorant and not to know what we don't know. And if we manage our geese effectively and then we manage Conrad effectively, then we gain understanding. So we're not chasing after ideas. We get what's behind and within those ideas. And finally, there is a point at which we wait, because you can't command this sort of insight. It comes when it comes. So let's look at why do we forget, and which is important to know. So if we see the female protagonist in this as generally representative of the soul, generally it represents the soul's journey, not the mind's journey per se, then why does the soul forget? And maybe in the stories of fathers and daughters we get an insight into that. Why do we forget? We lose knowledge of the golden age. It's there in all the religious traditions. There was a golden age when, told in different ways, humanity lived with the Godhead. Humanity was at one with the divine. Look at different religions, you'll get a different insight into it, but it's there universally in all the major religions. There was a golden age. And we can see that as being a time when the soul is unseparated from its divine origin, but it doesn't know itself. And when the soul comes to know itself, it eats of the tree of good and evil, it eats of the tree of knowledge, then it realises its separation. And it's in the Christian tradition, it's the cherubim who go and say you can't re-enter, but that is a principle. Because once you realise you are not the thing you thought you were totally part of, you then have to find out what you are, and then the journey starts. So one of the themes in fairy tales is this, and very often the first verse or the first two verses will be telling this in different ways. It's certainly there in Snow White with the pricking of the finger, because it's before the child comes. And the banishment is by the father, it's by principle, it has to happen, otherwise the soul would never know itself. So let's have a look at this story. A rich, it's important, look for the state at which the story starts. A rich man, right, had 3 daughters, and he asked them, how much do you love me? And the first daughter says, as I love my life. And the second daughter says, better nor all the world. And the third daughter says, I love you as fresh meat loves salt, says she. In other words, just right. And the father is outraged at this, because he doesn't understand the response. The father is outraged at this, and he immediately banishes her from the house. So she is sent forward on a journey, and she is left with nothing but her fine clothes. So the 2 older daughters remain, and she is on her own. And she goes out from the house and she comes to the riverside. And we've seen that already, remember, in the Goose Girl. She drinks of the river 3 times and she forgets. So when your protagonist ends up by where 2 realms meet, the watery realm and the earthy realm, then there's a change taking place. And she decides that she only has her clothes, that she decides she must hide who she is. People cannot know who she truly is. And she picks bulrushes, and she hides her fine clothes in a cape of bulrushes, and she makes herself a cape and hood, and so she looks like a person who is very poor indeed. And she comes to a fine house. And you'll know in fairy tales there's some point in the story whether you come to a house, or you come to a forest, or you come to a palace. Again, it's interesting to look at how it's described. So in this case, she comes to a house. And when she comes to the house, she has to cross the threshold. Again, we've seen thresholds before. Will she be let into this house? And they say to her, we don't need anybody. And she says, I will work for free. I will work for nothing. So they allow her into the house and she goes to the kitchen. So she agrees to work for nothing and do menial work, and we find her in the kitchen preparing food. And the kitchen, of course, is alchemical. You take natural things, you combine them together, and you end up with something that is quite different, and you can't reverse it. So the symbolism of cookery and the symbolism of the fire and the symbolism of the chimney take us right back to ancient Egypt with Mart, who represents the hearth and the fireplace. And in the Greek tradition, it's Hestia and Vesper in the Roman tradition. So the hearth, and if those of you who visited India and you go into an Indian traditional Hindu home, you will very often find they will have a god or goddess of the hearth as well. It's represented as being important. Well, a great ball is to be held. This is a Cinderella type story, so you know there's got to be a ball. A great ball is to be held nearby, and the servants are invited to go. And as with Cinderella, she's not invited, or they ask her, but she says, no, not me. She's too tired. But she does go later, and she takes off her cape of rushes, and she has her fine clothing, and her hair is now revealed. So nobody is going to recognise her as the lowly kitchen maid. And when she arrives at the great ball, of course, she captures the interest, not to say the heart, of the prince. She goes to the ball 3 times, and I think you'll find this in most of the Cinderella stories, and indeed many stories. You'll find that 3 comes up, and when you see 3s, it's usually representing a completion, a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it shows that a process is going through. So the prince has to meet her 3 times. She has to show herself to the prince 3 times. Make some gruel for the young master, they said to the cook. He's dying for the love of the lady. When she's gone, it's like he feels bereft. And so he wants some food. And the cook sets about making it when Kappa rushes. Now she's put her rushes back on when she returns. What are you doing of, says Kappa rushes. I'm making some gruel for the young master, says the cook. He's dying for the love of a lady. Let me make it, says Kappa rushes. Well, the cook wouldn't at first, but then later she says yes, and Kappa rushes made the gruel. And when she had made it, she slipped a ring into it on the sly before the cook took it upstairs, and the young man drank it, and then he saw the ring at the bottom. Send for the cook, says he. He finds the ring, and then he finds her through the ring, and sees her true glory. So we can say that what's represented in this process of going to the ball 3 times is her consciousness is rising from the kitchen, rising from the hearth, and reaching the level of the prince. And you can take the book when princes turn up in the way that they do in these stories with their sharp sword. They are representing intellect. They're representing the higher faculty of thought. So that is awakening, and that higher faculty of thought can then know her for who she truly is, can know the soul for who it truly is. We can recognise the soul within us, because there's a dance between mind with a capital M and the soul with a capital M for that recognition to take place. And they marry. But the tale is not quite yet complete. Right? Sometimes a story would end there. Pretty much that's where it ends with the Cinderella story. But in this story there's a codicil. And the resolution is going to come about where it started. It's going to come about through salt. So she says to her prince, I want to prepare a meal for my father, who lives in a house nearby. And the prince agrees to that. And she cooks a meal, but she doesn't put salt in the meal. And when the father eats it and realises that the meal has no savour, he bursts into tears, because he recognises now his daughter, and he recognises the truth of what she said. So he is representing tradition, or he is representing old wisdom that has to be renewed in some way, and this is the renewal through salt. So her journey, and in fairy tales you have the protagonist, but in a way all elements of the story are some aspect of the individual. You can see it as some aspect of the whole. So her journey is also his journey. So let's have a look at what's going on here. We've got the father, the sisters, Kappa rushes, the maids and the cook, and the master's son. These are all elements of the story. Kappa rushes, as I suggested to you, will represent the soul. The father has lack of judgment. When tradition is out of place, when it's a tradition from way back when, however true it may have been in the past, it may not play for now. So although a tradition may be venerated, it may not be the appropriate tradition for now. The maid and the cook will represent, because they're down in the kitchen, they're the instinctive powers. We need them. Our habitual powers, our instinctive powers. They're like the 7 dwarfs. When Snow White goes into the cottage in the middle of the forest, then the 7 dwarfs are around looking after. Forget the Disney version, but look at how it's covered in the Grimm version. They represent the powers of the body. We don't have to think about how our heart beats, how our digestion works, and so on. There's an intelligence that does all that. But we can't allow that intelligence to direct our decisions. So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the master's son represents, as I suggest, the higher mind or the rational intuition. And the fine dress could be seen in a number of ways, could be seen as the glory body of the soul. When we approach the wonder of the soul, it's glorious. On the other hand, it can represent all the innate powers of the soul, which will appear glorious too. So we have various symbols. We have the fine dress, the banishment and the fen, the cape and hood of rushes, the fine house, the kitchen, and the ball and the dance, and the gold ring. And each of these is going to be a symbol that we can ponder. And each of these we've touched on already. But when you're looking at a fairy tale, it's good after reading it and just enjoying the story to then go back and say, okay, what are the key symbols? What order do they turn up in? Where is the protagonist in relationship to them? And then they will begin to open up suggestions about what's being represented there. And the salt. So let's look at an interpretation of this story. The father sets a question, and the father does not recognise salt. So in this story, in some ways, salt is the most important symbol of all. There's banishment, there's the dressing in rushes. She loses the golden age. She's now out, not knowing who she is really, and having to be in disguise. But she keeps her dress. She has to do menial work by the hearth. She goes to the ball, but her glory is not recognised, not understood. She gets the gold ring. That represents that she's now unified. The soul and the mind have been unified. She understands who she is. The prince recognises her. And then we return to the father. Now we come back to the question of salt. One of the meanings of salt is that it counteracts poison. If somebody had been poisoned, they'd be given salt. To take things with a pinch of salt means the poisonous idea you take with a pinch of salt, because if you had been poisoned, you would take salt. If you took a lot of salt, you'd vomit. So that meaning is there, that it enables you to separate out falsehood from truth, poisonous ideas from real ideas. It also, in terms of its very name, contains what the Romans used it for. In ancient Rome, it was used in purificatory rites. The Latin sal means wit. And the wit in this case, common wisdom, is seen as synonymous with wisdom. It's wit in that sense, wit in the Shakespearean sense rather than being witty. And the cubic meaning, the cube represents earth symbolically, so it's also the meaning of the salt of the earth. And if you're the salt of the earth, you have that common wisdom. You have that deep understanding that springs, as it were, from the earth. In alchemy, it has a very specific position. So there are, if you study alchemy, you'll see that there are three features that return again and again in alchemical stories, and these are salt, quicksilver, and sulphur. Each of these has a profound symbolic meaning. The father is the seed of things, so it starts with the father. So the father is going to be the origin, and if the father is missing, then there's something original missing in that sense. If the father is present, then you need to understand the fairy tale as what is the state of the father? Is he rich? Is he poor? And the father sets the boundaries. The father says how things are. The father is the one whose writ rules the world. So in Tales, the father's condition is the condition of the world. If you look at the father's condition, that will tell you where this world is. So we're going to look now at the father's relationship with wisdom and the spiritual, and some of if you read the Grimm's tales of the early parts, some are quite uncomfortable bits of reading. Some versions of fairy tales that have not been prettified look like what they're suggesting is unpleasant. This is true of the next story we're going to look at. Once upon a time there was a king who had a wife with golden hair, and she was so beautiful that her equal was not to be found on earth. It happened that she fell ill, and when she felt she was about to die, she called the king to her and said, "If you want to remarry after my death, then do not take anyone who is not as beautiful as I am, and who does not have such golden hair as I have. That you must promise me." And the king promised that to her, and she closed her eyes and died. And the king dutifully looks for somebody who can match his wife. And he looks all around the kingdom and he finds nobody except his daughter. And so he decides that he should marry his daughter. Now the daughter senses this is not a good idea, okay? That this is not the way things should be. So she sets him in this story, because she's horrified, she sets him a series of impossible tasks. She says, I will marry you, father, if you can bring me 4 dresses. The first dress should be made of the sun. The second dress should be made of the moon, of the light of the moon. The third dress should be made from the light of the stars. And the father does this. He goes up because he's the king. He manages to get a dress that is made from the light of the sun, a dress that is made from the light of the moon, a dress that is made from the light of the stars. And he brings these to his daughter, and she, like daughters get with their father sometimes, is exasperated. She has these beautiful dresses, but she does not want to marry her father. So she gives him a 4th task, which is to bring her a dress that is made of 1,000 furs of every animal type in the kingdom. And of course, being the all-powerful father, he does do that, and he brings her the dress, and she thinks, well, this is no good, I have to flee. So she flees, and she goes out to the window of the palace, and she goes into the forest. And when in a story you go into the forest, as Snow White does, when the huntsman does not kill her, and she goes into the forest, then you are talking about the realm of nature, and you're always in the realm of illusion. The Greeks used to call it hyli, and it's where things are not as they seem. So she goes into the forest and she finds a tree that is hollow, and with her cape of all furs, she hides in this tree, but she has kept her 3 dresses in a nut. So she hides her dresses in a nut, flees to the forest, finds a hollow tree, and a king of this forest, not her father, a king of this forest is out hunting. Now huntsmen, it's largely accepted, is always about death forces. So she has entered the realm now of life and death. She's in a hollow tree. What might that represent? The womb, the body, the enclosure. So she's now in a foreign, if you like, she's in a foreign body from which pretty much she's born. And she's born from that hollow tree because the dogs come and sniff her out. So the dogs will represent just the instinctive forces. The instinctive forces are there. But that's all she has. So she now doesn't know who she is. She is wearing all these kinds of fur. Therefore she's of the animal kingdom, representing universality of the animal kingdom. And the king has found her, but doesn't know who she is. And she needs to hide who she is because she cannot show her true nature at this point. So she blackens her face so her true glory isn't revealed, and she hides her golden hair, which conceals her wisdom. And as you might expect, she works in the kitchen, and they give her this name, Alalirau, and a ball is held. The king decides to throw a festival, and she is invited to come, and she comes in disguise. She goes to her nut, and she takes out the dress of sunlight, and that's what she wears first. And she takes her oil lamp and she goes to her cubbyhole and she takes off her fur cloak and she washes the soot from her hands and face so her full beauty can be revealed. And she opens the nut and takes out the dress that glistened like the sun. And after she had done all this, she went upstairs to the banquet. Now notice this happens downstairs, it happens out of a cubbyhole, it happens from a nut that is too small. We're not talking something literal here. She goes upstairs, which indicates a rising in consciousness. She goes to the banquet where everything is possible. And everybody steps out of her way because nobody knew her and everybody thought she was a princess. And the king approached her and reached out his hand to her and danced with her and thought in his heart, "My eyes have never before seen such beauty." When the dance ended, she curtsied. So she dances with him in the dress of the sun, and then she goes back and disguises herself in the kitchen. And after she's returned to the kitchen and was about to set to work and sweep up the ashes, the cook said, "That's enough till tomorrow. Make the king's soup for me." so I can look upstairs, but don't let a hair fall in it, or in the future there'll be nothing more for you to eat. And the cook went away, and all kinds of fur made soup for the king, and she made bread soup as good as she knew how. And when it was done, she got her golden ring from the cubbyhole, and she placed it in the bowl that the soup was in. So she's given a spiritual gift to the king. You notice the king has got younger in this version. So she gives her spiritual gifts, but she's unconscious of what she's giving at this time. So it's being received not with full awareness. And when all kinds of fur arrive, the king asks, "Who are you?" And she says, "I'm a poor child who no longer has a father or a mother." And he asks, "What are you doing in my castle?" And she answers, "I'm good for nothing except for having boots thrown at my head." And he asks further, "Where did you get the ring that was in my soup?" "I don't know anything about a ring," she responds. And he holds another festival, and this time she dresses at the light of the moon, and she returns to her disguise and prepares the king's soup, and this time she puts in a golden spinning wheel. Many, many stories have this, at the point of transformation there are 3 golden objects, and the sequence of those objects is important, and it's not always the same. So let's have a look at the interpretation of what's going on here. So the 3 times the king holds a festival. She dances with him first as the sun, second as the moon, third as the stars. He keeps her longer and slips the gold ring on her finger. After she returns, she puts a gold reel in, so she has now received the gold ring back. She puts a gold reel in the next time, and once more the king sends for her. So here's a possible interpretation of this. The dresses, the sun, the moon and the stars, can be seen in the occult tradition of which Great Britain is very rich in, as being the mental, etheric and astral bodies. That's one suggestion. So these are the subtle bodies that are recognised in some traditions. They could also be seen as the glory body of the soul, what it finally gets to when dressed as the sun, as the celestial or formative body, which would be the lunar aspect of the body, and then the astral body. So there are various ways, and I think with fairy tales it's useful just to hold these things lightly and see what's suggested to you. The nut would be the seed that passes from life to life. So there's a continuity to the soul's existence. The ring would be unity, beginnings and endings are joined. So when the prince or king receives the ring and then gives it back, it indicates that those 2 principles, the intellectual principle and the soul principle, are now in right relationship with each other. The spinning wheel, which comes again and again in fairy tales, is spinning the yarn, which has a double meaning. Right? Spinning a yarn, telling the story, measuring a lifetime. And the spindle, which is the 3rd gift, collects it, which can therefore be seen as the memory. And in so many fairy tales, there's a forgetting of who the person is. And at the end of this fairy tale, the golden spindle indicates that the gold thread is now collected, and there's a memory of who the person is. So the journey of the soul is a journey in memory in that sense. So what's represented here with the sun, moon and the stars is found in all the great traditions, all the great philosophical traditions, all the great religious traditions. You'll find in some way or another the sun, moon and stars play a part. So in the Christian religion it can be seen as a solar religion, and intelligence then is represented as creative light, and out of Christianity sprung Hermetism that developed within the same realm as Christianity, even if it has its roots back in Egypt. And of course the star comes into the story with the Magi following the star to bring their gifts. That's the starry wisdom of Chaldea, roughly equivalent to the late Egyptian period, is representing the flow of that wisdom into the Christian tradition, I would suggest. Lunar traditions are Judaism and Islam. So when we talk of the 3 religions of the book, we have 1 solar one and 2 lunar ones in terms of their nature. And then the stars is the revealed light of the starry religions. And this then comes into this fairy tale. And if we go back to Egypt, which we can argue is the origin of the whole Western tradition, you will find there is a place for the sun, the moon and the stars. They all have gods representing them, and the myths are full of references to those things. Change of rhythm a bit now. We now move on to a story with a fairy tale structure, but much more complicated than your average fairy tale. So it's the story of Lear. What do you notice about the three sisters who are represented in this picture? Red, white and black. The artist knew what he was doing, right? The artist knew what he was doing, so which is very interesting to me. So you've got here the key players. You've got France, who is betrothed to Cordelia. You've got Goneril and Regan, and the two sisters representing duality. You've got Lear represented in this picture, his back turned, going out of the frame. He captures so much of the story just in this wonderful image. So we're going to be looking at the interplay of these characters, and we must expect now that we're moving to a different level of complexity, but also to a different level of subtlety. So Lear has three daughters, and he decides quite early on to divide the kingdom of Great Britain between them pretty much equally. Goneril and Regan receive a third part each, and say, rather like Caporushes, they love their father, beyond measure and without count. And King Lear then turns to his youngest daughter, and Cordelia can only speak the truth. She just speaks the truth. So she cannot dissimulate, and he says, now our joy, though last not least, and I assume that is the first time that phrase was ever used. Now last not least, he said, the best part of my kingdom have I kept for you. What can you say to Cordelia? Nothing, my lord, answered Cordelia. Nothing can come from nothing. Speak again, said the king. And Cordelia answered, I love your majesty according to my duty, no more, no less. And because Lear judgment is of this world, it's not of the realm of truth, he misunderstands. And Cordelia has stated she loves exactly as a daughter should love her father. And he flies into a rage. But the Duke of Burgundy, France in that picture, the Duke of Burgundy is impressed by her answer. He is able to hear her truth. So Cordelia is banished. So at this point of the play, Lear, whose power is beginning to wane, he's beginning to get challenges, he loses Cordelia. And in terms of the play, she is out of the play then until I think it's Act 5 she comes back in the very final act. So the whole middle workings out of play, Cordelia is not present at all as Cordelia. And the kingdom is divided into two, so we move into the realm now of duality. So Goneril marries the Duke of Albany, Regan marries the Duke of Cornwall, and Cordelia will marry the King of France. Lear has a knight, and he's the Duke of Gloucester, and interestingly it's spelled Gloster, the Duke of Gloucester, so it's a different spelling to the one that we use today. And the Duke of Gloucester has two sons, and one son is legitimate and one son is illegitimate. And the two sons here can be seen as Cain and Abel, they can be seen as Set and Osiris. They represent the principles of brotherhood in opposition, one being legitimate and one not being legitimate. And Gloucester's story runs parallel to Lear. We find here his trajectory, if you like, is similar. He doesn't really understand what's going on at the beginning. He gradually gets wisdom as time goes on. And to understand how this mystery story is being told, really you need to consider both strands of the story. So Gloucester and his two sons, Lear and his two daughters, and then Cordelia, who's been removed from the story. And remember I said it's useful in any story to look what is the state at the beginning. And I'm also reminded, and Julie correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm also reminded Joseph Milne, who has spoken here a lot about Shakespeare, said if you go back to the first folio edition of Shakespeare and you look at how the cast list is given, the very first name on that cast list is always representing the divine principle in the tragedies. So castles are man-made realms, right? We said they sort of represented the head and the consciousness. So we will find that this story takes place. It's a story of 3 castles and a wilderness. Britain is under the law of men. France, being yonder, is under the law of God. So France represents in this the divine realm. That's where Cordelia goes to in her banishment. Britain is here, the land of men. So we have Lear's castle, Goneril's castle, Regan's castle, and we have the heath. So these are the realms in which the story is told. So the elements representing evil are Goneril, Regan, Cornwall and Edmund, and they're set up against the elements representing the good, which is obviously Cordelia, and then the fool, and then the King of France, who is betrothed to Cordelia, and Albany, who is married to one of the 2 sisters, but he is dutiful. He always does his duty. So he represents that level of morality, that level of the nature of reality that is right in the middle, really, where you do your duty. It's essential for the system to work, but it's not the highest aspect, if you like, of spirituality. And then we have Edgar, who also becomes disguised as poor Tom in the wilderness in relationship to his own father. Cordelia is never on stage at the same time as the fool. The actor who would have played Cordelia is almost certainly the same actor as the one who played the fool, who's a young lad. So he represents the principle. So wisdom can appear foolish to a silly old man. So, so the fool comes in holding the principle of truth right the way throughout the story.
The word silly comes from Selig, meaning blessed as well, doesn't it?
So this is a journey for King Lear, it's a journey for Gloucester, it's a journey for Edgar, and they are aided by, in the way of fairy tales, there are those who are there to support the fool or Cordelia, poor Tom or Edgar, and Albany. So you get this structure of each of these 3 here faces a trial in different ways, and each of them has support in different ways, or gives support. And as always in fairy tales, there's always a force that is in opposition. I don't think there's a fairy tale around that is a true fairy tale where there isn't at some point something that comes up against the protagonist, has to beat it, deal with it, overcome it, hide from it, whatever. So they're attacked by Regan, who's married to Cornwall, Goneril, Edmund, the illegitimate son of Gloucester. And it's a mystery play, so we can see it as being, like all the tragedies, as representing something of a high mystery for those who can see it in that way. So King Lear he's competent to rule, but he's not wise. He hasn't acquired wisdom. He goes through dispossession, then he goes through banishment. So we can see these same elements coming in. He loses his kingdom. He even descends into madness. But in the end he achieves humility and oneness with nature. Once he's out in the wilderness, he finds an alignment, if you like, with the wisdom that is to be found there. And at the end, he sort of recognises Cordelia, and then we get the mystery of death occurring. So it's also a mystery play that deals with sons. So we're dealing with this relationship, the Cain and Abel relationship, the good and evil relationship, and the able to see and not able to see relationship. Gloucester has no discernment. He can't judge anything until he's blinded. And he's duped and betrayed by Edmund. He banishes his true son, Edgar, and he's blinded by Cornwall. Now, almost always in mystery plays, the blinding to this world means that you open your eyes to the other world. So almost always when you come across a blind character in a mystery play, it represents wisdom. So he finally gets wisdom when he has lost sight. And the wandering in the wild heath, blind, led by his son Edgar, poor Tom. And it's a mystery play about sisters, so we've got the role played by Goneril and Regan, who cast out their father. They take the old tradition that he represents, the old order, and they cast it out. But they are consumed variously by lust and greed. They lust for power, they lust for Edmund. So they destroy Gloucester's sight, both want Edmund and the throne, and finally they destroy each other. So that always in duality it has the seeds of its own destruction within it. And the battle between the brothers has echoes of Hamlet and Laertes, the best of friends who then become the worst of enemies, Set and Horus. And it has in the play the trial by combat. And this trial is important because when there's a trial by combat, the one who is better militarily would be expected to win. But when it's an actual trial, there is the assumption that the divine will intervene and the one who is most true will win. So Edmund is the better soldier, but he's never fought where he's being judged spiritually, and that moves him into a different realm. So he's not in his world and he loses. So Edgar has virtues, betrayed by Edmund. He's almost naked in the wilderness, and when you are naked, just like the taking off of the clothes and laying them down in front of Jesus when he comes in on the ass, can represent the changing of ideas. So your garments are your ideas, your clothes with your ideas. So becoming naked means you're open to other possibilities in that sense. And he's mad, he goes to Bedlam, but anybody who is deeply spiritual in this world appears mad to people who are in this world, not and unable to see the other world. And he becomes guide to his father and meets Edmund in trial by combat, and he wins. So it's a mystery play also because death comes into the story. Death in a fairy tale always marks a change of state. When the horse Falada has its head cut off, and this happens quite a lot in fairy tales, so you get, for example, the wolf in the Firebird leads the younger brother in the Firebird right to the end and then says to him, "You must cut my head off." And the cutting of the head off means the intellectual part is removed from the natural part, so it means the thinking is now released from nature. So it will always mark a turning point when that occurs. Martin Lings says Lear and Cordelia can be seen as one being. Lear now represents the soul, interestingly, so it's not with the feminine principle this time. So Lear represents the soul, but separate from the spirit. So when a soul truly loses itself, it doesn't cease to be a soul, but it's a soul now without true judgment. And Cordelia, who is truth and goodness, is lost. So his acts are unwise, evil prevails, he doesn't see the truth of things, he gets banished and lost. But virtue lives on in Edgar and in Albany. So death comes in various ways. Cordelia is murdered by Edmund. Well, clearly the spirit can't actually be murdered, but it can be apparently murdered or lost to this realm. King Lear dies when he thinks that she's alive. That's when he can finally let go. Martin Ling suggests, as I was just saying, that Lear represents every man or the soul, Cordelia the spirit, Albany, the King of France, and Edgar represent virtue and the future. Lear was what was. This is what's to be. And to be reached, there has to be a death. I'll repeat myself a bit now, but this is now in summation on fairy tales, and then you're going to get one to work on. So take note. Right. So where does the story start? Who's there at the beginning? What's missing? Who's missing? Who dies? You can always look at that in the first couple of paragraphs of the fairy tale, and it will give you the starting point, what type of tale this is, and where the balance needs to be found. So, for example, in Hansel and Gretel, hard by a great forest, there dwelt a poor woodcutter, so that the wisdom is lost, with his wife and 2 children. Or Beauty and the Beast, there was once a very rich merchant who had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. So look at the beginning, because it will set you up for the nature of the story that's going to come. the number of daughters, the number of sons, whether it's mother, whether it's stepmother. This will indicate the state of play, and it will show where balance has to be restored. Very often, if a mother is replaced by a stepmother, then very often it is the spiritual mother is replaced by the natural mother, or the mother nature, or the witch. So the stepmother is necessary, but her rule is the rule of nature. And what's the situation? So all kinds of a king who loses his perfect wife, Snow White midwinter, which we touched on. The queen has a daughter white as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood. Then the queen dies, which is the experience of the soul. You're there with your origin, and then you're not anymore. East of the sun, west of the moon, poor peasant, the cottage, the youngest, prettiest daughter, the winter storm, and so on. What precipitates the story? There's always going to be an event, as there is in any good film. Okay, the king wants to marry his daughter, Snow White. The stepmother is jealous. East of the sun, a bear arrives, and the daughter gets pledged to him. Cap of Rushes, the father banishes the daughter. There's always a dynamic that sets things going. What happens in the middle of the story? What is the nature of the journey? Where does the journey take place? Caring for the geese, dealing with Conrad, working in the kitchen, going to the ball, meeting the master's son, revealing part of their nature, living with the 7 dwarves. And there's always some final trial. There will always be some test at the end before there's a resolution. And what's the situation at the end? The Goose Girl gets restored to her rightful prince. The false maid is banished. The ring is spotted in all kinds of fur, and the truth is found, and the master is married. Snow White, the prince awakens Snow White with the kiss, and there's marriage. Cap of Rushes, the father finally gets true discrimination and understands the meaning and the mystery of salt. Who's there at the end? Just like who's there at the beginning? Is there now a king and a queen? Is there a male and female principle in balance with each other? Or there's not usually both, one or the other. You can look for these things. You will almost always find them in the fairy tales. See where this is dealt with. So what might they mean in the context of the journey? So look for what represents the spirit or the divine. Look for what represents the soul. Look for what represents that part of us that truly knows, the power of true intellect. What's the lower mind? Where's the desire nature? The bits of us that throw things up into our consciousness that are amoral because they come from the natural realm. The transient world, the thresholds that are crossed, and the small but significant details.